So we're going to look at an era, a very short era, but a very tumultuous era, because it has a lot of parallels with Australia and the rest of the world in 200 years later. We're going to look at between 1810 and 1820 and the type of political prisoners which were transported to Australia and why they were transported to Australia, and what was happening in Britain, and the impact it had on this country's First Nations people. And then I'm hoping at the end to tie it all together to show that what happened in Britain during that period, where there was a transition from the feudal age to the industrial age, is very similar to our situation today, where we're moving from the industrial age into the digital age. All right? So that's what I'm going to try to do it. Whether I succeed or not is a different matter, but we're going to try. Now, we need some background about what was going on in Britain just before this period. Now, what we saw with the advent of machinery was that the relationships which had existed for centuries in Britain were changing. And they were changing radically because the machine age required labour. And most of that labour was provided by peasants in a feudal age who had, contrary to expectations, both rights and protections, common law rights and protections, and legal rights and protections under British law. And their main protection came from the fact that we had common land. And common land was fundamental to preventing starvation amongst peasants during the feudal era, because common land meant that they could grow subsistent crops on that land, they could graze their animals on that land, they could capture game on that land, and they could also create a community in that land in terms of community festivals, some of which had gone back pre-Christian thousands of years. Now, between 1770 and 1830, 6 million acres of common land became private land. So the squire and the developing entrepreneurial class came together in terms of creating a cheap labour source. So from a period where if things went haywire you could still survive with your family, very subsistence type of existence, people have now been pushed out of this common land through the changes in the law, which meant that those rights and protections they had, like the ability to catch game, the ability to grow food independently of the squire, the ability to harvest firewood, which was essential during that period, disappeared overnight. So they became landless labourers who depended on the squire or the new industrial society which was being created because of the machine age. So that's the background. So in any period where there is a major change in the way people make their living, there is major fractures occur in society. Now, what the government did in order to prevent widespread starvation, instead of setting a minimum wage, what the government did, it promised to, It promised to provide wages to charities, mainly religious charities, so that they could actually create what are called workhouses in order to ensure that people didn't starve. So they were given the responsibility to prevent starvation in a land where there was just basically landless labourers who'd lost that common land, went to the workhouses, the private charities. It was outsourced. That responsibility was outsourced. So they were supposed to make up the difference. But unfortunately, as we see during this period, with the changes of the Poor Laws in 1795, what actually happened is that these charities, mainly church charities, which ran the workhouses, had a great deal of options in terms of who they accepted, to pray and work the treadmills in these workhouses. And that's where the term the deserving poor and the undeserving poor came from. The deserving poor were those who were allowed to work to an inch of their lives so they get a bit of food and not starve, and the undeserving poor were left to starve. These were the people who drank, didn't pray, didn't show any respect for authority, and the list goes on and on. So now, this is the great period of British history when Britain finally defeats Napoleon in 1812. But this is the beginning of the destruction of British society. And those in power, and remember 12,500 votes actually determined whether the Whigs or the Tories were in power, because only a very small number of people were allowed to vote. Those in power decided that to use the full force of the state in order to crush any opposition to the enclosures and to starvation. Now, the first resistance occurred between 1811 and 1813, and these are the much maligned Luddites. Now, the Luddites weren't landless labourers. They were skilled workers, weavers, craftsmen. And what had happened is, with the introduction of the steam engine and the machine age, that the tasks that they did were able to be broken into various components. They've come to take you away, mate. Various components, and these components were then actually created the final product. So, say if you're a weaver, with the introduction of machinery, the various things you did for a final product were done by machinery, which was supervised by labourers, not skilled people. So the Luddites were skilled labourers who had suddenly lost the ability to make a living, and they would have to take a huge decrease in wages as, labourers. And they came across what we saw then was an era of what's described as sabotage or machine breaking. So today we think of the Luddites as mindless machine breakers who are trying to prevent progress. The fact is that the Luddite Revolution, which occurred in northern England, mainly York and Leicester, and to a lesser degree in East Anglia and Wales, the Luddite Revolution was basically a mechanism of workers' control. I know it sounds difficult to believe. It was workers wanting control of the productive process, because when you're a craftsperson, you control the productive process. When you have a machine doing the work, you've lost that control of that productive process, as well as the quality of the end product. That was the first thing. The second thing about Luddism, which is interesting, is that it is something. It's like collective bargaining, because what happens is that by destroying the machines, these people are acting collectively to improve their situation. And at the same time, there was something really interesting about the Luddite revolutions or revolts, is that they were leaderless. We had a collective leadership. What that means is everybody, their mythical leader was Ned Ludd, so everybody who was a Luddite was Ned Ludd. It's a little bit like the cartoons that you see of the Guy Fawkes mask when everybody walks out and they're all Guy Fawkes. Well, everybody was Ned Ludd. Now, the landowners had made now their peace with the emerging entrepreneurial classes who own the machines and own the factories. So the machine breaking between those two years caused a lot of heartache amongst both groups. So what Parliament did is in York and Leicester, it declared a state of emergency, send in 12,000 heavily armed troops to put down the revolt, and use the full force of the law against the Luddites. 8 Luddites were killed by the troops. I think 25 were hung and 42 were transported to Australia. So that movement kind of reached a crescendo and then dissipated because of the state's reaction, which was quite... Not only did they declare a state of emergency, they also suspended habeas corpus, which means you didn't need to take people to court. So that little revolt was crushed. But the influence of the Luddites continued, because at the same time the Luddites were revolting in York and Leicester, the Napoleonic War had finished. So what happens when a war finishes? The countryside was flooded with returned soldiers and naval personnel, many who had lost limbs, because if you broke your leg in war in those days, the treatment was amputation. So you had this competition between the people who were there and these huge influx of soldiers. At the same time, the workhouses increased, had much more stringent regulations about who they could help because of the decreased amount of support they were getting from the government of the day. So what this created was starvation in England, because people could no longer use the common lands to grow their own foods. They were landless labourers who relied on wages to survive. So you had starvation in places like Sheffield, Nottingham, Carlisle. This is in 1812. At the same time, we saw that the workhouses were no longer able to cater for the increasing number of people who actually needed support in terms of to prevent starvation, because that's all the workhouses were. They were to provide support in terms to prevent starvation. So what we saw was an increasing number of pauperised, starving workers begin to revolt spontaneously. Not organised rebellion, but spontaneous riots when people obviously needed food to exist. At the same time, the government increased the number of hanging offences, and this is fascinating. To demand wages, to demand rent, to demand food were crimes punishable by death, by hanging. To write threatening letters, punishable by death. To poach a rabbit, not just on the common lands that had been enclosed, which would be given to the private sector, but also on public lands, because that was removed also, meant hanging, was a hanging offence. So there were hundreds, literally hundreds of hanging offences. At the same time, we had these starving mobs who were going around breaking machines spontaneously, burning down haystacks, destroying houses, demanding money. And what happened is that what we saw is the embryonic development of a consciousness which hadn't been there during the feudal age amongst basically landless labourers who only had their labour to sell. And if they weren't able to sell their labour, they and their family faced starvation. So you've got a new consciousness developing, not just amongst the landowners and then the new entrepreneurial class, but amongst the 90% of people that were being exploited in terms to generate profit for them. So you've got this growing consciousness. At the same time, you had laws in place which prevented, these were called combination laws during that period, which prevented people from coming together in an organised fashion to improve their situation. So it was a very, very difficult time. So what happened? Well, I'll go through a few of the revolts because they're interesting. You've got the East Anglia rural revolt, which is in the north of England. And what happened in 1916, what happened is that the people of East Anglia revolted. The revolt was put down because you've got to remember in these days there was no police force. The police force didn't come into effect till 1829 when Sir Robert Peel, created a police force for the rural areas. Before you had rural peacekeepers, but with the breakdown of the feudal system, there was no mechanism apart from armed force to create, to deal with so-called disorder, right? So the type of people that were used were basically yeomen, who were basically professional soldiers, and their methods could be quite brutal, and I'll go into that later on. So during the East Anglia revolt, I think 83 were tried, 25 were hung, and I think it's for you. That's for you, Oscar. and 19 were transported to Australia. Okay. Now another hanging offence was taking an oath. And people, when they combine, they take an oath. It's a little bit like your mission statement if you're part of a club. At the same time, laws were passed to stop meetings, to stop drilling, which means people coming together, and seditious libel laws were passed, which was aimed at muzzling the radical press, which was grown in strength and popularity. Because you've got these ex-soldiers, many of them wounded, and sailors, who've been part of this, grand victory against the Napoleonic forces, demanding some type of compensation for their sacrifice. It's a little bit like after World War II when Churchill was voted out and a Labor government with a social agenda was voted in. But that's a different story. But it was the same thing. And if you fight for your country, you expect something in return. You don't expect to be faced with poverty and starvation and, you just don't expect that. So that creates a climate of resistance. At the same time, we saw these fascinating little rebellions breaking out across northern England, because northern England and the Midlands was the area where the industrialisation was taking place. At this stage, southern England was basically still a feudal society, and next month I'll talk about what happened there in the 30s. So what happened is, I'll give you an example of a very interesting little revolt. There was a Midlands committee which wanted to create a revolt in the Midlands of England. And there's one group which was based in Nottingham, in the village of Wingfield and Pentrich. And they had a leader this time, a Jeremiah Brandiffe. That's right, this is Jeremiah here. A Jeremiah Brandiffe. But as in all these revolts, as we spoke about last month, there were spies. 35 were arrested. Jeremiah Brandiffe and his 2 lieutenants were hung, and 14 of the 35 were transported to Australia. Now, transportation was a really, really evil punishment, not just for the men that were being transported and the occasional woman, but for the families of these men, because there was no social security system. It basically meant starvation for them, because they had no access to the common land anymore, because it had been privatised and given to the landowners. At the same time, in 1815, a year before the East Anglia revolts, there was the introduction of the Corn Laws and huge riots in England where the army was called out to protect Parliament and the royalty, in inverted commas, because the Corn Laws, during this period of starvation, the Corn Laws were introduced as tariffs to bolster the profits of the landowners who had enclosed the peasants' land. So having tariffs for basic food like corn meant that prices increased dramatically. Profits increased for the landowners because through the introduction of threshing machine and other agricultural machine, they were able to expand their empire. If any of you go to England these days, you'll go to those wonderful 5,000 acre estates which have been robbed, you know, which we all love. But going back to the riots all through London, which were put down violently, obviously, again by soldiers, no police force during this period. Now let's get him back to, we spoke about poor old Jeremiah, didn't we? Yeah, Brandiffe, yeah, hung with his 2 lieutenants, Paul and Elaine, both hung. Now, I mean, it's a little bit like the Robin Hood story. He went to capture Nottingham Castle, but got waylaid on the way. Now, at the same time, we saw a number of what are described as conspiracies by radical Republicans. Yes, there have been radical Republicans during British history. And these radical Republicans in 1820 attempted to blow up the British cabinet in Parliament, you know, trying to emulate that Roman Catholic Guy Fawkes from the 17th century. But they failed, and 5 were hung, and 5 again were transported to Australia. 1819 was a very important year because this is when things began to turn. This is when the government began to come under extraordinary pressures. Now, nobody gave a shit in England and Britain about what was happening in Ireland a few years previously, where tens of thousands were slaughtered when they rose up for independence. But in 1819, the weavers in Manchester, which had become a huge industrial hub, held a large family picnic at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester to push their demands for increased wages. The local authorities were so concerned that they got the Lancashire Yeoman Cavalry to deal with the situation. We had thousands of men, women and children, Gaza alike, having a picnic, and the Lancashire Yeomen rode into them with drawn sabres and hacked their way through the crowd, killing 11 and wounding 400. And in those days, if you were wounded, your chances of infection were high. There's no medical facilities, and there's a good chance men, women and children, which we don't have an account of, would have died as a consequence of this. Now, the radical press had a field day, and they called it the Battle of Peterloo, mocking the Battle of Waterloo a few years previously. It was the Battle of Peterloo where the great British forces won this great battle against people having, men, women and children having a picnic. Now, nobody was arrested here. The Whigs and the Tories, the Whigs were the entrepreneurial class, the Tories were the old landowning class, and the Tories were in charge at this particular point in time in the English Parliament, were aghast at what happened, because this could have been the beginning of widespread revolts through Britain. And they tried to hose down the situation, and they did successfully hose down the situation temporarily. The next year, what we saw is some incredible revolts, initially in Scotland and then in Yorkshire in 1820. What happened was that the skilled workers in Glasgow, concerned about the industrialisation and the breakdown of their crafts, demanded a vote. That's all they did. They demanded a vote. It was a little bit of hijinks, but they demanded a vote. 88 were arrested and tried for high treason under the charge of conspiracy to subvert the Constitution. As we saw with the Scottish martyrs, previous with intellectual bourgeoisie, and remember, this is not intellectual bourgeoisie, these are landless labourers and powerless craftspeople. What we saw is these laws, draconian laws, being utilised to try to suppress dissent. Now, high treason is a particularly heinous crime under the British Constitution. And don't forget the rebels, the Eureka rebels in 1854 were charged with high treason. There is only one punishment for high treason, and that's hanging, drawing and quartering. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. It's very civilised, almost as good as what's happening in Gaza. James Wilson was one of 25 of the rebels who was sentenced to hang, but because he was identified as a leader and because he refused to take part in what he called a mummery of a trial, it was ordered for him to be hung, drawn and quartered. This is a type of execution that hadn't happened for over a century. It's more of a medieval execution. What it means is, first of all, you're hung till you're nearly dead. Then you're laid out on a table and the executioner does a laparotomy with his sabre. You're still alive. He then pulls up your intestines and your intestines are burnt, and they're good reason. Because as the smell wafts over the crowd, that is a smell you will never forget. This is theatre. This is theatre of the macabre, but it's theatre it's about intimidation of other people, because if you do this, this is what will happen to you. Conspiracy to subvert the Constitution. Then after that, if the executioner has been ordered to, they'll remove your heart and you die, and they put horses on either limb and pull you apart. But Mr. Wilson didn't have that joy. While still alive, deboweled, half awake, he had horses attached to his limbs and they were pulled apart. This is 1820. Under the law, legal punishment for the heinous crime, not of killing somebody, not of revolting, not of burning down a haystack, maiming cattle, sending threatening letters, but for the heinous crime of conspiracy to change the Constitution, to ask for the right to vote. At the same time, workers in Yorkshire went on a rampage, and a number of them, I think about 19 were arrested and transported to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. So, you've got this interesting situation, fascinating. You've got the land-owning class and the entrepreneurial class coming together to oppress the people they need to make money for them. Although you've got machines, you still need labour. People, as they moved from a feudal age to the industrial age, began to understand they had a lot in common, but weren't able to form trade unions or even any type of organisation because of the Combination Act. The Combination Act is an act which prevents people coming together to look after their own interests, right? At the same time, you've got a period in British history which you haven't seen for centuries, where the courts and the laws are being used in a very violent manner in terms of to suppress dissent and create fear in the community. So this is what it's about. It's about intimidation and fear. Now, you can only get away with this for so long. And it wasn't long before the Whigs, which is the opposition party, took power, and I'll talk about that another day. So, what are the similarities between 1810, to a nice little story about, executions and oppression, and 2024, when we're sitting here having a beer, munching on Chinese takeaway, having a bit of chocolate? Well, it's very interesting because the dynamics are the same. Because we are going through a huge transition where the way people earn their income is a threat. And although we've got a social security system, that social security system only prevents starvation and homelessness to some degree. Now, the privatisation of the commons, 6 million acres, is very similar to the privatisation we've seen in this country in the last 40 years. The privatisation of essential services, the privatisation, of the public education sector, the privatisation of public housing, anything that was public, privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, Telecom, Qantas, you name it, the airports, the ports, everything has been privatised. So that bulwark you had against poverty or security has been removed. Because when you've got a public service, you have access to the public service, not because you're a deserving or non-deserving poor, but because you're a citizen or a permanent resident. So what's happening is many of the structures, what we call the social elevator, which allowed me and people like Jeremiah here to get a free education and become upstanding members of the community, right, disappears. So what we are doing is, by having the same kind of interaction, what we are doing is we're recreating that period without the executions, because there are no riots. And there are no riots in this country, although there's an increasing increasing element of self-destructive behaviour, because through social security system and through the financial sector, where most people are in debt for a variety of reasons, they have been able to keep the lid on things. But at the same time, we are seeing the growth of a political philosophy and ideology, not just in this country, but in Western Europe, or most of Europe, where division begins to be the major political impetus, major political strategy. We're divided on the basis of race, what we wear, the colour of our skin, the language we speak, our gender, our sexual orientation. And we have huge sections of society which actually, through social media as well as the legacy media, promote these divisions. Because while we're divided on these, what I term relatively superficial factors, we begin to forget who we are, who the oppressor is, what has happened in the last 40 years, that the rich have got richer, the poor have got poorer, but the increasing element of insecurity. And when I say there is no riots, we are seeing this in a number of ways in our society. One is a lot of people internalise that insecurity. We have increased anxiety, increased what I call reactive psychiatric illnesses, not endogenous, like paranoid schizophrenia, but things where you're reacting to the situation you find ourselves in. And for the first time, for a very long time, the most common cause of death in the under 35s is suicide. Second most common after accidents is suicide. We have extraordinary numbers of younger people who suffer from anxiety, although we're supposed to be living in the land of milk and honey, who are under psychological and psychiatric care because people are internalising these issues. At the same time, we have a media and a social media which continues to divide us. Nothing was more than what happened at the church in Sydney 48 hours ago, where we saw social media come out in this huge divisive campaign in order to divide us in terms of our so-called religious preferences. So we've got this. At the same time, we are seeing the growth of a new generation of young people with no future, who understand they have no future in the digital age. They don't understand it like they join the dots together, but they understand, they know there's no future. Because the social elevator has been destroyed, we've got to the ridiculous situation where we have private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. Now, if you told me that 40 or 50 years ago, I would have laughed at you. It's a growth industry. We have all these so-called institutions to protect our rights, but when you try to access that, it's almost impossible. For example, I was talking to a patient yesterday. It took him 2 years, and he's an intelligent person, to go through the process to resolve a dispute with a bank. 2 years through the right channels. So what does the no future generation do? Crime. A lot of the violent crime you're seeing today is from younger people. It's not just Aboriginals and kids in Alice Springs or the Northern Territory. We see it in Melbourne. You see it in every city. So, there are, in my opinion, there are huge parallels between that period of British history, the transportation which occurred, and what's occurring today. And the dilemma is that nobody is really paying much attention to the underlying causes, because I know those that listen to the program will be bored with this, but we have 27 million people living on a resource-rich continent. 27 million. This is in Bangladesh with 150 million living the size of Tasmania. It's 27 million living on a resource-rich continent. So what's the problem? Even in Iraq, which has had 1 million dead in the last 20, 30 years, even in Iraq, its natural resources are owned by the people through the state. 50% of Iraqians are actually employed by the government because it uses oil revenue to employ its people. In this country, we rely on the mining sector. We rely on the mining sector employing people. It only employs 2% of people because it's highly mechanised. And we rely on royalties which are peppercorn, and we rely on taxation revenue. So what other idiot would allow their natural resources to actually be owned by somebody else who brushes crumbs off the corporate table in their direction? So no wonder when people talk to us, and this is like 1810 to 1820, they talk to us and they say, there's no money. There's no money for public health. There's no money for public education. There's no money for this. There's no money for that. There's no money for psychiatric services. For example, if the person who was responsible for the slaughter in Bondi, as we're told, had a major psychiatric disorder, the dilemma is that in this country, because of privatisation, people with major issues have to rely on the public sector, and the public sector is grossly underfunded. Why is the public sector grossly underfunded? Because most resources go to the corporate sector. And the corporate sector not only has corporate welfare, as we've seen in the last few days, as we saw in 1810 to 1820, where they enclosed the commons and introduced, corn laws to put tariffs on a basic food when people were starving. But we've got a corporate sector which receives billions of dollars directly from governments. So instead of creating a public resource or public institutions, what we do is we give money to the private sector to provide services to us. Now, obviously, public institutions have a number of failings, but they also have a number of things going for them. One, any profit that is made doesn't go to shareholders, it goes to all Australians. And most of the public institutions which were privatised were profitable. Let's not forget that. Even Medibank Private was putting in 100 million into the coffers, so they were profitable. And people have forgotten that. They were profitable and the money went back to the treasury. At the same time, if we developed as a nation our own resources publicly, the amount of money that would come into the country would resolve, in my opinion, most of the problems we have, and we could also have a universal basic income. So it's very similar. What we're seeing is a small minority increasing their power at the expense of the majority of people. People putting private interests before public interests. For example, early childhood development. What happens is you get lots of little companies shoot up. The natural endpoint of capitalism is the creation of monopolies. Now we've got 3 to 4 large corporations run the child care industry. They get billions of dollars from the government because the government subsidises most of that. Aged care industry, when they changed the ratio, of nursing staff, got rid of that, we saw the private sector come in. Look at the disasters we find ourselves in today because of the privatisation of the aged care industry. Because whenever you have privatisation, you have 3 people in the bedroom. You've got 3 people in the bedroom. Yeah, I know, Jeremiah. So you may find that interesting. 3 people in the bedroom. You've got the private sector, the corporation, the private investors, and the public. And we're usually kicked out of bed. When you've got a public service, you've got the public and the government. So, to me, what's happened now is very similar to what happened during the privatisation of the commons in Britain. But today, instead of doing what happened in Britain, where it was a much more cohesive society, what we're seeing is increasing divisions and the rise of political forces and ideologies and parties which thrive on these divisions, which in many regards could replicate what we saw in the 1920s in Europe, where we saw the growth of authoritarian movements. So, there are parallels. I think they're real. I think we have lessons to be drawn from that. And all I can say is that It's frightening when you look at history because there's always parallels. Nothing new. There is nothing new in human history. We may have fancy machines, we can send people to the moon, we can kill each other in extraordinary ways, mass slaughters become the issue of the day. But when it comes to human interaction, when it comes to power, when it comes to wealth, what we saw between 1810 and 1820, we see in Australia today, the concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands. And that does create issues for the community.